In this devlog, we're going to continue our banking application by providing some CRUD functionalities for our Rails models. So if we look at the current application, we have a bunch of models already included, which are the bank account, the client, and an account transaction. So the relationship again between a bank account and a client is that a bank account belongs to a client, meaning we actually have a foreign key client ID for all instances of bank accounts that would relate to a primary key for the client's table as defined by the client model. And complement to that, a client can have many bank accounts. So the first CRUD that we'll do is a bank account for a given client, meaning once we add a new bank account, we should be able to specify the client that this bank account belongs to. Okay. So to start things, we'll go to our routing file and remove the restriction for the routes only index and show for the bank accounts resource. Once we do that and try to examine the routes by running Rails routes or rake routes if you're using a Rails version prior to version 5, we should see the routes generated for us by Rails pertaining to the entire CRUD cycle for a given resource. We have index, the method index, which would most likely list all available instances of a given resource, of a given bank account. The create method, which would define how to build a new bank account once the information is submitted to the server. The new method, which will display the form containing the details that the user will fill up to create a new bank account. The edit method, which works just like the new method, but will serve for editing will serve for editing the information for a given bank account. The show method, which we've already seen, which will contain the details of a single bank account, and the update method, which is actually complementary to create, which will update the information of a given bank account, and finally the destroy method, which will destroy an instance of a bank account. So again, using the rake routes or the Rails routes command, you will be able to see all the available routes generated by Rails for you. So we'll first get started with the controller part of the bank account, wherein we have to define the new method, the create method, the edit, the update, and finally the destroy method. All the new method will do is that it will create a new instance of bank account and render the necessary form for the user to input the details. So you simply do bank account equals bank account.new. So what I'll do here is I'll first program all the methods that are needed and then render the necessary views that will be attached to a given method. Now the convention for Rails is that for any method in a given application controller, in this case a bank accounts controller, it will render a page or an HTML otherwise specified by the render method. It will defaultly render a page named after the controller, in this case bank accounts, under the view directories of the application, which we already have right here, after the name of that particular method. So what I mean by this is that if we have a new method right here, under the directory bank accounts, you should have a new.html.haml method to complement that given method. Okay. So I'll open both files right here, and I'll just put a simple header called new bank account to specify that we're in the new page of the bank accounts resource. Now what I'll do is that I'll attach it to the index page so that every time the user visits the system, it will that user will be able to redirect to a new page for the bank account. So right here we can probably have something like, or I'll actually include it here with the previous link. So I'll have something like link to new bank account path, and then pass the text that's needed by that would be embedded inside this ahref tag. So that would be new bank account. Now, just as a review for the convention, the reason why we can do this variable new bank account path is because when we define the resources bank accounts in a routing file and look at the routes defined by this resources command, you can see here a section, a prefix section, right, that would correspond to the variable that points to a particular route. So in this case, if I wanted the route that points to bank accounts new, then I would use the prefix new bank account followed by an underscore path suffix for this particular variable. So to actually get this route, I do new bank account underscore path, which will generate this route for me. Okay? So that's what we just did right there in the index page. Okay, so we have a link there, link to new bank account path, new bank account. And we'll go ahead and test to see if it redirects to that page that we just created. Alright, so we go to localhost and we should see the link right there. Okay, so we have our previous link to all bank accounts right here and the link to new bank account right there. And what I'll do is I'll just fix the presentation for this so we don't get confused. So probably we have some border right here. Right, so we have a bunch of links right there. Okay, so when I click new bank account, it should bring me to the page with the header that I just created, new bank account. Now what I'll do is, so the purpose for this page is to display a form that will contain the details that the user will have to fill in to create a new bank account before actually submitting it to the server. So if we review how a bank account is structured, what I'll do is I'll go to schema.rb and see that I'll need a field for the account number as well as the client. So if you notice, we had a belongs to client part in the bank account model, which actually points to this field client underscore ID, which is the foreign key to the client's table. Now I won't be providing a field for the balance because according to our bank account model, the balance is already set by default every time we create a new account. Okay. Now, once I identify the fields that are needed to put in the form, what I usually do is I go ahead and use another gem called simple form, which makes the form creation process for resources much easier and much intuitive for the developer. Okay. So what I do is I just include that in my gem file and run a bundle install. So it will actually download the gem needed so you can actually use it within your application. And the way simple form works is that given a particular resource, and assuming that you follow the convention for resources, you can just declare something like simple form for followed by the resource that you'd like to create this form for, and it will automatically bind all the fields that are necessary for this particular resource. So in this case, the object that I'd like to bind to this form would be the @bank account, which is passed from the bank accounts controller into the view layer of the method, which is in this case the new method. Now, just like an ordinary form in Rails 5 or in Rails, you usually have this f object or this variable that would represent each particular field in a given resource, in this case bank account. So for example, if I needed an input for the account number of this bank account, what simple form provides for you is a method called input, which handles all the input functionality necessary for a given field. So in this case, if the field I needed was account number, then I'd have something like f.input followed by a symbol pointing to the field of this particular resource, which in this case is bank account. Now just to see what that looks like, if you refresh this, okay, so we have the field there for the account number as well as the label, right? So simple form automatically reads the field name and converts that to a label for your input form. Okay. Now if you're using Bootstrap, what you usually like to do is to include a wrapper or CSS wrapper for this particular form so that it follows the classes defined inside the Bootstrap framework. Now we can actually do it here in simple form for part, which generates the form tag, but I actually forgot the syntax. So what we can do is we can include an input HTML key value pair after the account number, wherein the value is an object where you can include all the attributes that you'd want for this particular input element. So in this case, if I wanted to incorporate, let's say, the form control class from the Bootstrap framework, which is a class definition, inside my input HTML declaration right there, I can have class form control, which will inject that class form control attribute inside the HTML for my account number input. So here, refresh this, it will follow the form for the class needed for the account number. Okay. Now, if we notice the model for bank account, again, the bank account has a relationship for the between the bank account and a given client, wherein a bank account belongs to a client. So every time we have this particular scenario, what we can do using simple form as well is to tell simple form that this particular attribute for the class bank account is actually an association for another model, which in this case is the client. So what we can do is f, instead of f.input, we can have f.association and pass to it the client symbol, which corresponds to the object or to the related object for a given bank account. If we refresh the form, simple form will automatically include or will automatically detect that it's actually an association and pull all the related records for a given client model. So in this case, I just have one instance of a client, so that's the only thing included in my select box. So simple form is actually more intuitive than using your plain old Rails form because it automatically guesses the correct element for a particular field. Okay, so before moving on, I'll just tag this input element with class form control as well. Refresh this. Okay, it will follow Bootstrap's form control. Next thing I'll do is, well, I won't include the balance, but I'll show you how simple form even detects the data type of a given field. So let's say for the field balance, okay, that field is actually is of type decimal, which is a numerical value, and so simple form will automatically create a text field which is numeric, meaning you can only input numbers inside this particular input element. So if I have input HTML, class form control, you can see that the form detects account number as a string, so it provides a text field tag. Simple form detects that client is an association, so the default would be a select or a drop down input element. The same goes for balance. It detects that it's a numeric data type, so it automatically provides a numeric input field for this particular field. Okay, but we don't really need the balance because it's automatically generated for us. So I'll remove this and go ahead with the submit button. So under I probably have a section here called form actions. I think Bootstrap has a definition or a class declaration for this, a style for this particular class, form actions. Let me just put in a button there. F.input submit. Right. I think we'll create a submit button for us. Oops, wrong. I think it's f.submit. Right? Say save. You can actually put a class there. Button primary. Right? So we have the save button right there. Wait, just that. Whoops. Actually, I just use a button tag. Button tag submit. Rather, button tag type will be submit, and the class will be a primary button from Bootstrap, right? And then I'll have save bank account. Right, so you have a button right there for saving. Well, we don't have the form actions declaration, but that's okay. I'll just use an HR line instead to differentiate the controls from the actual input elements. Right, so we have save bank account right there, and we probably can have something like a link to root path, which will bring me back to the home page of my application. Give it a class, let's say button default, do cancel. Right, so we have a nice cancel button right there. Okay, so how would simple form know where to submit this information? Well, if you're using the Rails convention, then simple form will automatically see that this is a new instance for a bank account, so it will pair it with the create method in the controller. Bank accounts controller. Okay, so it will actually fall under this section of the controller after a user submits data from this given form. Now, the typical code for this part of the controller will look something like the following. Bank account equals bank account dot new, and then you can actually fill in the parameters bank account, let's say balance, or no, sorry, rather account number is equal to params bank account number. So the way simple form wraps the request information before passing it to the server is that it will get the resource name, in this case bank account, and create a hash that will contain that resource name's key, or the name of the resource as key, as well as a child objects that will contain the key value pairs for each given field. Right? So we can actually extract the information like this. Okay, just to show you, we'll raise params at this point. Raise params .inspect, so that we'll force the system to have an error after we submit this information. Right. So once we submit, we can display all the needed or all the information that the simple form is passing to the server. And we can see that this is the parent object, bank account, whose value contains a set of key value pairs, the account number, and the client ID, which is 1, which is the ID of the client that we selected, right? So we can also notice that all this information is actually not permitted to be saved in the server side, in your application. The reason behind this is because Rails uses what are called strong parameters, which prohibits a user to pass in a hash with corresponding set of values, and it actually gives the responsibility to the developer to allow only particular fields from a resource to be accepted into the server, right? So in order to solve that particular problem, what we can do is we can create another method here, and I'll call it bank account params, which is a method that will define the parameters that are permitted by your application to be passed into the hash for this particular resource, in this case bank account. So the way we do that is we take the params object and we say params that require bank account, which is the name of the resource, and we call a permit function or a permit method and pass to it the only fields that we'd like to bind or that we can allow to be part of this bank account object. So in this case, that would be the account number and the client ID. So this is actually a security measure so that users can't inject new keys, especially for those who are familiar with the way Rails works. They can't just simply inject a particular key inside the form before the user actually submits it, but rather the server will have to process first that hash, that resource hash, and select the only fields that are permitted to be submitted to the server. Right? And this method, bank account params, can be passed to the bank account.new or the constructor of a bank account object. So we call bank account params right here. Now, once we bind the parameters that are needed into our new bank account object, we can try to save it to the database by calling the save function of this object. So if bank account.save, then we do something else. We render the new page again of our application, right? So most logic for CRUD functionalities, at least for the create and update, is to first get the parameters submitted from the form, try to save it inside the object, and then redirect the user back to some other page on a successful save, else render the form or the page that would contain that form. Right? So the user can input or correct whatever the mistake he or she did. Okay. So let's say that after I create a bank account, upon successful creation of the bank account, I'd like to redirect to the bank account path, which is the show part of our bank account resource. So in this case, it will need the bank account's ID. Right? So once we do bank account.save, it will actually persist this object and assign it an ID corresponding to the primary key of this newly created object. If there are some errors, then I'll render new, which will render the new html.handle page and bring the user back to the form. Okay. Now let me give you an example wherein it will actually go back to the form and display the error messages for this given resource. Going back to our model, if you remember, we actually had some validation, right, where presence is true and uniqueness is true, meaning I can't repeat the same account number for all bank accounts found in my system. And we know that we already have a bank account in our system, which is account number 0000001. Right? So if I actually try to create a new bank account, so refresh this page and try to create a new bank account for that given client and try to submit this information, okay, the system will throw an error has already been taken. And if you notice in our code, we didn't specify any part in simple form to display where the error actually renders. So this is another nice property of simple form, where in simple form not only provides the label and the type of input element, but it also provides a section which binds closely to the validation rules of your Rails object, which in this case would be the uniqueness or the presence, and automatically renders the error message in the event of an error. Okay. So to correct this, I'll create a new bank account with a new account number 000002, save it, and it should redirect me to the show page. Okay, so I don't have, let's see, undefined method ID for nil class. Oh, I think I misspelled. Okay, so the error here is that I don't have an ID attribute for the nil class, which is bank account spelled with 3 C's. Okay, so that's actually my mistake, a mistake on my end. So let me just correct that and move that, right? Now if I try to resubmit it, Rails will think that I'm actually submitting a new, it actually occurred at this part of the code, so the bank account actually got through. It actually saved into the database. So if I try to refresh this, it will think that I'm resubmitting bank account with account number 00000002, and it will produce an error has already been taken. So if I click cancel and go to bank accounts, I can have that 00002 right there. Okay, so just for example's sake, let's say we actually have a third bank account. Actually, I'll put the new link in the index page of my bank accounts as well to make it more convenient. So probably I'll have a link right here, link to new bank account path. Actually having a hard time doing this live coding session because I'm in the roof deck of our building, so it's a bit windy and it's a bit noisy, I guess. Okay, new bank account, button primary. Okay, so if we refresh this, we should have that new button right there. If I click this, right, we have it right there, and let's say I'll create a new bank account with account number 3 with that same client right there. Save, right? So once I save that, then it will redirect to the show page, and then I can perform the necessary transactions for this bank account. Okay. So actually now would be a good time to put another link that will bring me to the index page of bank accounts, right? So link to bank accounts path, class button, let's give it the default button, back to bank accounts, right? So back to bank accounts will bring me back to the index part of the bank account, and now I have 3 bank accounts. Right? Actually, now would also be a good time to modify this index and include another column for the client, right? So I'll know which client this account actually belongs to. So it will be bank account dot client, which will automatically fetch a client object because bank account belongs to a given client, right? And it will display here the clients, which are just the same person for all 3 accounts. Okay. Now, what I want is, if I view a bank account, let's say I want to change the format of the account number. So that particular use case will call for the edit portion of our CRUD cycle, right? So now I'll program the edit and the update portions of the account cycle, of the CRUD cycle rather. Okay, so the first thing I'll do is I'll check out Rails routes again. So edit here, okay, requires the prefix edit bank account, wherein you have to pass an ID, right? If you notice the URL signature right here, if you see a colon in the route that corresponds to a parameter in the URL that you can extract eventually in the controller side of things. So in this case, it expects a value for the parameter ID that we pass to it. So what I'll do is in the show page, right? Let's see how it looks like. Let's say I want to change this to something else. Probably together with a new transaction, I can have an edit button somewhere here, right beside the new transaction, or I'll probably put it below after the transactions table. So I have something like new edit bank account path, and pass to it the ID because the route needs an ID for this particular edit bank account prefix. So give it something like button info to differentiate it, and say edit bank account. Right, so I have that link right there. If I click it, right, okay, it should produce an error because I haven't created the template or the view relating to the edit relating to the edit method of the bank accounts controller. So before I create that view, I'll have to extract the bank account that I'd like to edit. So we know that we're passing an ID parameter from the URL, so I can just use that information to look for a bank account according to the ID by using the bank account find method. Okay, once we have that, I should be able to create the edit.html file. Okay, just to make sure that we're in the edit portion of the page, I'm going to put some text in that file for edit. Okay, so if I refresh this, it will bring me to the edit page of the bank account. Okay, now what I'll do is I'll go to the new HTML file, and I'll just copy the entire form, which is another advantage of simple form. Since simple form follows the Rails convention, and it detects that this particular instance is not a new record, right? It's a persisted record, meaning it already has an ID assigned to it. It will automatically bring the user or submit the information from the user or from the client to the update part of the bank accounts controller. Now, since both codes are repetitive, then it means that I can actually move this code into another partial. So I'll have something like form.html.haml, right, and transfer everything in that given partial. Now, a good practice for partials is to use local variables instead of instance variables, even though it will actually work, right? So bank account is different from @bank account, and in order for this partial to have that particular value, from the edit section, I'll render that partial. So render partial edit, and pass to it bank account, whose value is the instance variable bank account. Or sorry, render partial form rather, right, and pass the bank account to it. Same goes for new. I can remove this, copy this, and paste it right there. Okay, so they have the same exact code. The only difference will be the header file, and I can actually include something like let's say I'd like to display the bank account number. So I know I'm actually editing this particular bank account. Okay, so let's say I wanted to include something like 01-00001, for example. Okay. So before I try to save the information, I should go back to the controller and provide the code for update. So the code for update will look almost exactly like new, right? But if we look at the signature for update, which is right here, it will require to pass an ID as well, which is the ID of the bank account that you'd like to update, or the resource that you'd like to update. So for bank accounts controller, we can use that parameter ID to fetch the bank account that we'd like to edit, right? And then try to save it. But before actually saving it to the database, we have to use our params method right here again to pass the information from the form into the bank account object. So we try to update it by calling the update function and pass to it the method bank account params, wherein upon successful save, we'll do the same logic for the create, wherein we redirect the user to the show page of the bank account. Upon error, instead of rendering new, we render edit, right, which is the edit page of the bank account. So if you try to call this method again, simple form knows that it will bring it to the update section of the system, which also passes the required ID. Okay, so if we update it, we now have an updated account number of 01-0000001. Okay. So you can actually edit all these things as well. So let's say for this one too, I can edit this and pass to it 01-2, save it, redirects to show. If you go back to bank accounts index, it should reflect the necessary edit. The last thing I'll do is to try to delete this last this last record, because I just want 2 accounts for this. So I'll probably have the delete function right here as well beside the edit. And okay, if we review the delete function, it looks exactly like, the prefix is like bank account, which is for show, right? But the verb being used is a delete. So we have to explicitly define that verb so that Rails knows that it should go to the destroy method of the bank accounts path. Okay, so the first thing I'll do is create a link that will define that particular verb. So the show method, in the edit, right beside the edit button, I can have a link to bank account path, which is the prefix for the delete. But for it not to go to the show page, I'll explicitly define that the method is delete before passing in the necessary classes. Button danger, I think. Right, do. One thing we can also include here is to include a data attribute, confirm, or are you sure, wherein Rails will automatically create some nice JavaScript prompt for us before we actually call this link. Okay. Now, it's actually dangerous to delete a bank account if it has a current balance, so we'll have to have some sort of protection or some validation for that scenario. So the easiest way to do that is to go to in the destroy method. We first fetch the bank account and check if the bank account's balance is greater than 0. Then we redirect the user back to the show page. Else, it means we can actually delete this bank account. Of course, in a real world scenario, this wouldn't be the case because you probably have some more complex validation for something as sensitive as bank accounts. Now, I won't redirect to the show path because this object has already been deleted after calling the destroy function. So instead, I'll go back to the bank accounts path, which is the index for bank accounts. Okay, so the logic is we fetch the bank account, we check the bank account's balance. If it's greater than 0, then redirect to the show page for the bank account. Else, we can destroy that bank account and redirect to the index page of the bank accounts. Okay, so let's try this here. I'll show this page. Okay, we have the delete button right there. Delete. It prompts us. Okay, and redirects back to the index. But for this transaction with 1,100, if I try to delete it, it has a balance greater than 0, so it should bring me back to the show page. Okay, it was too fast, so it didn't actually go through. Right, let's go back to bank accounts here, and we'll delete the second account. It has a balance of 0, so the delete function should go through. Right. Okay, so that completes our CRUD cycle for a given bank account. And I should probably stop the coding session right there. Right. Okay. So what we did right here is we defined a resources bank accounts, which defines the necessary paths for our CRUD function. In our controller, we defined we programmed all the necessary functionalities for creating, reading, updating, deleting a bank account. And we used a new gem called Simple Form that allows us to simplify the way we generate forms by simply specifying f.input followed by the field name for a given object that's bound by this particular form.